What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. Today we are going to check out the macro that I've created for augmentation evokers starting out in the War Within. Now, of all the videos I've made so far on different class and specs and sequences, this one comes with the most, like, I guess, quid pro quos or whatever. Like, this one, you've got a lot to consider because on paper, I feel like I've made a pretty functional sequence, but in practice, it might be a different story. So we'll go through this, okay, and take a look at our build here, and hopefully you'll understand what I mean by this. This is definitely one that it's hard to say how far you can push this and at what level this will actually work effectively, okay? I haven't had a lot of opportunities to test this one, but I have definitely played around with it a lot, and I do think that this can work. If nothing else, this can work when you're doing things solo, if for whatever reason you want to solo as an augmentation evoker. So I don't know if you'd want to do that, but yeah, we'll talk about it, and if you understand the nuances and the way the spec works, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so yeah, augmentation evoker. Left side on this is pretty much all, utility. I mean, almost all of this is utility. It doesn't matter what you do with, and there's really nothing worth talking about. Everything on this side, you're obviously going to be managing with a separate button. On the right side is where we get into the abilities that we use, and honestly, the thing about Evoker is you're building most of your rotation through the talents anyways, so all the abilities that you're taking are pretty much what you're going to want to take, and they're what you're going to be using. So we'll go through some of them, like starting off with so the thing about augmentation evokers is the idea is that technically you're a damage dealer, but you're a support damage class. It's kind of like its own thing, kind of like how paladins were, back in the day when they were like, when Ret was more of a support class that did DPS. It's kind of like that, I guess. But the way these abilities on paper, in theory, are supposed to work is like Even Might increases, for nearest allies' primary stat, right? So you can use this in theory without having to target anybody, and so this is just one that you can use on cooldown, and it'll do its thing. And then we have, Eruption. This is how we spend our essences, so that one's pretty easy and pretty straightforward. Then we get into Upheaval, right? And so this is our empowerment ability. Now, if you watched my Devastation Evoker macros, then you know that empowerment abilities, because of how they function, we're going to have to manage them on separate buttons, just because there's no real reliable way to macro these. And plus, it's good to have a little bit of control over them. That way you can control what level of empowerment. So this is why this is technically I guess it's a 4-button, 5-button if you include Azure Strike, but this is primarily a 5-button playstyle, because you're going to use Azure Strike when you're moving on a separate button. Then you've got your 2 empowerment abilities being Fire Breath and Upheaval. Those are your 2 empowerment abilities. You're going to have to manage those on separate buttons. And then, of course, you've also got Breath of Eons. This replaces Deep Breath, and this is another one. This is a ground targeting ability that you can control how far you go, so you definitely want to have full control over using this, and you would not be able to put this in a macro for many reasons. So much like your empowerment abilities, this is one you're going to manage on a separate button. So you've got some specific abilities that you're going to have to manage on separate buttons, and those are the 4 of the 5 abilities. So 2 of them being your empowerment abilities, 1 being your Breath of Eons, your Deep Breath ability, and then of course Azure Strike for whenever you're moving around. That's another one that you may want to cast while you're moving. So that's all by itself, but then everything else is pretty much managed. Like we said, we talked about Even Might. There are a couple more though that we want to go over, and I have to find them here the best I can. So this is one. Is it Prescience? I don't know how you say it, but either way, so this grants an ally the gift of Foresight, increasing their critical strike, right? Now, this has 2 charges, and what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to affect the nearest ally within 25 yards, preferring damage dealing if you don't have an ally targeted. So I'm imagining that on paper, you should be able to cast this ability when you're in a group without having to target anybody, and if the ability works the way it says it does, then that's going to put this on your allies for you, okay? But you are able to target people and do it. So I imagine, knowing this game and knowing, you know, how people play it and how to play it effectively, this might be something that would require you to navigate your user interface for and actually target the right players to get the right buffs on them to be the most effective. You see where I'm going with this? So there's a degree of nuance here that can make this not function very well in terms of, like, you know, how much control you have over using these abilities when you use them and all that kind of stuff. So that also applies to our final ability here. If I can find it, no, it's not that one. Here we go. Okay, blistering scales. Again, this is supposed to apply it to whatever your target is targeting, which 9 times out of 10, if your tank is playing properly, should be your tank. So in theory, you should auto cast this on your tank if you're targeting an enemy that should be facing your tank. And of course, if you're playing by yourself, then you're going to cast it on yourself because your target is targeting you. So that works out as well. Or if, you know, say you're playing with somebody that's not grouped up, it's targeting them, I guess you'll help them. So you see what I'm saying? The whole point is that on paper, if these abilities behave the way the tooltips say they do, then I would get the impression that you don't necessarily have to target things, but putting that in actual practice is a different story entirely, as well as, you know, matching the windows properly, using abilities at the right time. And those are just the standard things that we deal with when we use our gnome sequencer macros, sequences, you know, that whatever. And so that's always going to be a problem, and especially in this case, because though you're a DPS, you're a support DPS, you're not quite a healer, but you're a support, like an Overwatch support, you know. So being more effective and being as efficient and as effective as possible is very important if you're taking your gameplay seriously and you're in a situation where you need to be as efficient as possible. So hopefully you understand what I'm saying by all this. On paper, this should work, but I'm sure there are nuances to the class where it may not work as effectively as I would like to hope it will. But at the same time, functionally, this macro will work with all of these abilities, okay? So the last thing, of course, you know, you go down here, and if you do the time skip thing, I would definitely say pick up this follow-up talent with it, which just gives you a passive reduction to cooldown. So everything else is, you know, it's pretty much just taking, you know, stuff that's going to buff other things or whatever. So it's not entirely important. It's not going to change up how the macro works. But yeah, there's a lot to talk about there, looking at these tooltips and understanding this class. Like I said, it's all going to come down to the nuances of the class in terms of how effective it's going to be. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at the actual macro here, and you'll see exactly what I mean. So we have our one macro for augmentation evokers. This is going to cover everything besides the abilities that we mentioned, your augment, your empowerment abilities, your deep breath or breath of eons, that stuff. But everything else is in here. This is going to be very similar to how I designed my devastation evoker macros, if you watched that video. But yeah, so we start off with a loop, a reverse priority loop. I like to use these, and we're prioritizing eruption at the top. That way we're trying our best to use our, essences as much as possible. Then we have prescience in here, and that's next. So this is going to be used pretty often. It's prioritized over our filler ability, which is living flame. And because these other abilities are higher up, they should go off more often than living flame will. And so living flame should not take over the the sequence, but there's always a chance that it might, because it is our standard filler ability, and that can happen. But in my experience, this seems to do a pretty good job with using a reverse priority. It simply means that everything above living flame will have a higher chance of being used. It'll get more there will be more times when the macro tries to use these other abilities over Living Flame, and that's what's most important. But I oddly only have a repeat of 1 here that seemed to work the best, so that way we could get down into our abilities that are outside of the loop. And these abilities all have slightly longer cooldowns, like closer to 30 seconds or longer usually, and that's how like I keep those types of abilities on the outside, so that way we're not putting them inside of this priority here and slowing down, getting through these main abilities that we'll be using most of the time. And so those 2 extra abilities are Blistering Scales, and I put it at the bottom here, so that way like you'll go through the priority a bit and then you'll get to Blistering Scales, and that should give your tank enough time to acquire targets. And so whatever you're targeting should be targeting your tank by that point when you use Blistering Scales, and it'll go on what it's supposed to go on. So it's going to keep using this one on cooldown. And then of course we have Even Might down here with Tip the Scales, because it's an off global cooldown ability, so we can kind of pair those 2 together, and this will go off hopefully every 30 seconds or so. But again, we have it on the outside of the loop because again both of these abilities have longer cooldowns. So the idea here is that it's going to focus mostly on what's on the inside of the loop, and then once it goes through the rotation once, it's going to go to the outside and then try to use these other 2 abilities. And again, I have it on a repeat of 1 to make sure that we're giving as much chance as possible for these other abilities to function. So effectively that means that Living Flame, Blistering Scales, and Even Might all have the same chance to be activated, whereas I would say because of the reverse priority, Eruption has 3 chances to Living Flame's 1 chance, and then Prescience has 2 chances to Living Flame's 1 chance. So basically the whole goal here is to give these other 2 abilities more of a chance to be used, while everything else gets cycled through, occasionally. That's kind of the idea here. Okay, and so that should mean that Living Flame should still go off often enough that you're casting it when you have nothing else to do, but not too much that it's overtaking the macro, and then you're not casting anything else is the idea. So in theory, to kind of reiterate or summarize, what this is supposed to do is it's supposed to spend your essences, keep all of your abilities on cooldown, and then use Living Flame when you have nothing else to do. 9 times out of 10, that should be how this works, but there's always a chance that you'll cast Living Flame when something's off cooldown. Again, that's just kind of what you have to accept when you use a sequencer macro like this. And then of course you've got your empowerment abilities, which you manage separately. Breath of Eons, Azure Strike, if you're moving, you can have that on your bar separately as well, and use that one when you're moving around. That's also something to remember. But besides that, that's pretty much it. The biggest challenge with this macro is more the nuance of the class and getting the most out of it. So like I for one like this, I'd say yeah, you could probably run this I don't know, when you're doing solo stuff, and just have some fun with it. Maybe if you're doing a normal dungeon, you can test it out and see how it works, or maybe even, who knows, maybe you could even get by in a heroic. If the abilities work the way the tooltips say they do, I can't see why this couldn't work. But again, it's hard to say. It's just an interesting class with very unique abilities that have new, rules to them, and it's just a cool idea. But either way, if you want to give it a try, you can do that. Feel free to copy this and import it into your GNOME sequencer in game. Don't forget to hotkey it, and if you do check it out, I'd love to know what you think about it in the comments below. Let me know if it's working out for you. And with all that being said, I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.